Okay, let's talk about one of the most baffling, unsolved crimes in modern history. At the dawn of the new millennium, a family was brutally murdered in their home in Japan. But here's the thing. The killer left behind literally everything. DNA, fingerprints, clothes, you name it. So why is this case still a complete mystery? We're going to dive into a true crime story that is just a total paradox.
This quote from one of the lead investigators, it says it all, right? They called the crime scene a mountain of treasure. They had everything an investigator could possibly dream of. It really seemed like this was going to be an open and shut case. But that treasure trove of clues? Well, it would turn into a mountain of contradictions.
And that's the question that has haunted detectives for over 2 decades. How could somebody leave so much of themselves behind and still manage to become a complete ghost? To really get why this case is such a head-scratcher, we have to start with the tragedy itself. We need to know who this family was and exactly what happened on that awful night. So meet the Miyazawas. Just a completely normal, happy suburban family. You had Mikio, the dad, Yasuko, the mom, and their 2 young kids, 8-year-old Nina and 6-year-old Rei. Everybody in the neighborhood liked them. They were even planning on moving to a bigger house soon. They really had everything to live for. And then, on the night of December 30th, 2000, the unthinkable happened. An intruder got into the house through a small bathroom window on the 2nd floor. The first victim was little 6-year-old Rei, who was strangled while he was asleep. His dad, Mikio, heard a noise and went to check, and he was met by the killer and stabbed to death. The attacker then went upstairs and murdered Yasuko and 8-year-old Nina. In just a handful of minutes, the entire family was gone.
And this is where the case goes from simply tragic to just unbelievably bizarre. The murders were over, but the killer? He didn't just run away. No, he stayed. For hours.
What this guy did after the murders is what makes this case so infamous. He actually used the family's first aid kit to patch up a cut on his hand, leaving his own blood all over it. Then he went into their kitchen, ate ice cream straight out of the container, and then surfed the web on their computer. He even used their toilet and didn't flush it, leaving, well, another perfect DNA sample. It's like he made himself at home in the middle of this horrific crime scene.
So all of this strange, audacious behavior meant one thing. This killer was incredibly careless. And that carelessness, you'd think, should have led police right to his doorstep.
The crime scene was an absolute goldmine for forensics. They had not 1, but 2 murder weapons. They had clear fingerprints, and they had the killer's DNA from everywhere. Blood, saliva, even his feces. He even left his own clothes behind. This is the kind of evidence that usually gets a case solved in a matter of days.
Okay, so let's try to build a picture of this guy from the stuff he just left behind. First, he was wearing a purple jacket from Uniqlo. A pretty common brand, sure, but it was a start.
Then you have his shoes, a specific brand, Slazenger, and a specific size. Now, this little detail would end up being a massive clue, but not in the way anyone expected.
And finally, a very distinct gray bucket hat. So, police had a full outfit, they had his DNA profile, they had his fingerprints, they basically had everything you could possibly want, except, a name to go with it.
Because when the police started to follow up on all these seemingly obvious clues, the trail didn't lead them to some local criminal. Instead, it shot off across the globe, creating the profile of a killer who seemed to be a complete ghost. The killer pretty much became a phantom, what some have called a global ghost. Every single piece of evidence seemed to point in a completely different direction from the last, creating a profile of a person who just didn't seem like they could actually exist.
Okay, so check out how confusing this gets. Those Slazenger sneakers he was wearing, turns out they were only sold in South Korea, and his paternal DNA showed markers common in about 1 out of every 4 Korean men. But then, and this is a big but, sand found in the fanny pack he left was traced all the way to the Mojave Desert, near a U.S. Air Force base in California. And wouldn't you know it, there's a major U.S. air base just an hour's drive from the crime scene. So, what gives? Was he Korean? Was he American? Was he both?
So, this wild international puzzle led to a bunch of major theories. Each one seemed pretty compelling at first, but each one also had some massive flaws. Let's walk through the 2 biggest ones.
The very first theory was a local one. It focused on a group of skateboarders who hung out in the park right behind the Miyazawa's house.
So on the one hand, Mikio had apparently gotten into an argument with some skaters about the noise they were making just a few days before he was killed. And the killer's clothes, the bucket hat, the jacket, that kind of fits the skater look. But here's the thing. Would a noise complaint really lead to someone wiping out an entire family? The motive feels almost impossibly weak, and police could never, ever prove a solid link.
Okay, so that brings us to the most popular and, honestly, the most complicated theory, that the killer was some kind of highly trained military operative, maybe even a hitman with international ties.
Now, this theory seems to tie up a lot of those weird loose ends. It explains the sand from California, the closeness to a U.S. base, and his DNA, which showed mixed European and East Asian ancestry. That could easily fit the profile of a child of a foreign soldier stationed in Asia. But it has one giant, glaring hole. Why in the world would a professional, trained killer hang out at the crime scene, eat ice cream, and leave his DNA absolutely everywhere? It just makes zero sense.
So in the end, all these theories are just that, theories. And the case has ballooned into the biggest, most expensive, and longest-running investigation in Japanese history, with a deeply, deeply human cost.
The sheer scale of this investigation is just staggering. Think about it. Over 250,000 investigators have worked on this case. They've processed over 16,000 pieces of evidence. There's a 20 million yen reward just waiting to be collected. And after all of that time, all of that manpower, all that money, the number of arrests made? A big, fat zero. And behind all those numbers and theories is this heartbreaking reality. Yasuko's mother, Setsuko Miyazawa, who is now in her 90s, has spent more than 2 decades standing at her local train station, handing out flyers, just hoping someone, somewhere, finally has an answer. Her entire life has been defined by this unimaginable grief that has no end in sight.
Which leaves us with the ultimate chilling question at the heart of this case. The police have this person's genetic code. They have his fingerprints. They have a detailed account of what he wore, what he ate. They know more about this killer than almost any other in history. So how, after all this time, and with all this evidence, how can a person just completely vanish?